There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a battlefield when a Tiger tank appears on the horizon. Veterans described it as the moment when everything else seemed to fade away, the distant artillery, the shouts of infantry, even your own breathing. What remained was just you, your crew, and 70 tons of German steel bearing down on your position. For Sherman crews in Western Europe during the winter of 1944, that silence meant you had perhaps 90 seconds to live. But on a frozen morning in the Ardennes forest, one tank crew discovered something that would seem impossible to anyone who understood the mathematics of armored warfare. You could make a Tiger retreat, not with superior firepower. The Sherman's 75mm gun was notoriously inadequate against heavy German armor. Not with better armor at Tigers, 88mm could punch through a Sherman's frontal plate at over a mile. What this crew discovered was something far stranger. They made a Tiger run using nothing more than standard recovery rope and the kind of improvisation that desperation breeds. This isn't a story about heroes, though courage was certainly present. It's about the moment when mechanical advantage met human ingenuity under conditions where both were pushed to their absolute limits. It's about what happens when the rulebook fails and survival depends on understanding not just how your equipment works, but how your enemy thinks. The Tiger tank represented the apex of German armored philosophy in late 1944. While Allied tanks were designed for mass production and reliability, the Tiger embodied a different approach: create a vehicle so formidable that numerical disadvantage became irrelevant. The numbers told a stark story. A Tiger weighed nearly twice as much as a Sherman. Its frontal armor measured 100mm thick, more than double the Sherman's 51mm. The 88mm KWK-36 gun could penetrate 165mm of armor at 500 meters. A Sherman's gun could barely scratch a Tiger's hide at that range. These weren't just statistics to the men who faced them. They were survival calculations performed in seconds while watching that distinctive silhouette emerge from tree lines or around village corners. Tank crews developed an informal protocol. If you spotted a Tiger and it hadn't spotted you, you reversed into cover and radioed for air support. If it had spotted you, you fired smoke and prayed your engine started on the first try. Standing and fighting was considered a death sentence, unless you had at least a 4-to-1 numerical advantage. And then you were expected to lose 3 tanks in the process. The Ardennes offensive had shattered this already grim equation. German forces, leveraging poor weather that grounded Allied air superiority, had punched deep into American lines. Tank crews found themselves fighting in conditions that nullified many of their usual advantages. The forested terrain limited maneuverability, the wind of fog prevented the rapid concentration of forces that American doctrine relied upon, and the Tiger battalions, deployed in greater numbers than intelligence had predicted, were hunting Sherman platoons like wolves among sheep. One particular crew will identify them by their tank's designation rather than names. As was common practice, had been separated from their unit during a chaotic overnight withdrawal. Their Sherman, part of a reconnaissance element, had become isolated when German forces cut the road behind them. By dawn, they found themselves in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. With fuel running low and radio communication sporadic at best, the crew consisted of 5 men: a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a bow gunner who also served as assistant driver. Each had survived multiple engagements. Each understood exactly how vulnerable they were. If you have your own story about armored warfare in the Ardennes, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The mechanic among them, the loader, whose formal training included recovery operations, had been examining their situation with growing concern. They couldn't stay in the clearing. German infantry would find them within hours. They couldn't retreat down the road. They'd heard German vehicle movement in that direction throughout the night, and they couldn't advance. Fuel reserves gave them perhaps 10 miles of travel, and they had no idea where friendly lines were. The loader had been inventorying their equipment when he noticed something unusual about how the recovery rope was stowed. Standard Sherman recovery equipment included 150 feet of steel cable rated for towing operations. The cable was designed to pull disabled tanks out of ditches, extract vehicles stuck in mud, or tow damaged equipment off the battlefield. It was brutally practical equipment, the kind of thing you never thought about until you desperately needed it. But this particular loader had spent time before the war working in a logging camp, and he'd seen what happened when steel cables under tension snapped He'd seen the devastation that hundreds of pounds of stored energy could unleash in a fraction of a second. The idea that formed in his mind seemed absurd even to him. But desperation has a way of making the absurd seem worth attempting. He began explaining to the commander what he'd noticed about cable tension and potential energy, about how a cable under extreme load didn't just hold weighted stored energy like a compressed spring, and about what that energy could do if released suddenly in a confined space. The plan they developed was born from understanding their enemy's psychology as much as mechanical principles. Tiger crews were confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance, and for good reason. They'd been taught that their armor made them nearly invulnerable to American tanks. Standard doctrine for Tiger commanders encountering isolated Shermans was straightforward: advance to effective range, fire until the target was neutralized, then continue the mission. There was no need for caution when you outgunned and outarmored your opponents so completely. But confidence creates blind spots, and blind spots create vulnerability. They selected their position carefully. The clearing had a natural choke point where the forest road narrowed between two stands of dense trees. The loader calculated that they could position the Sherman just beyond this narrows, making it visible to anyone approaching but forcing them to enter the confined space to get a clear shot. Then came the delicate part: setting the trap itself. They ran the recovery cable across the road at what the loader estimated was the precise height of a Tiger's tracks, approximately 800 millimeters from ground level. The cable was anchored to two substantial trees, one on each side of the road, with the attachment points positioned to create maximum tension. But here's where the mechanics logging experience proved critical. They didn't just tie the cable, they used a technique called a drop loop, where the cable was secured in a way that would hold under a gradual tension but could be released explosively when a specific anchor point was pulled. The physics were elegant in their simplicity. When the Tiger entered the narrows, the cable would catch on its track assembly. The tank's own forward momentum would create tension, approximately 70 tons of force moving at whatever speed the commander chose. That tension would be distributed across the cable, the anchor points, and most critically, the Tiger's own track system. If they could trigger the release at the moment of maximum tension, the cable would snap like a whip, with enough force to potentially derail a track or, at minimum, create catastrophic damage to the drive wheels and suspension. But the plan required perfect timing and a willingness to expose themselves to fire. Someone had to be positioned to trigger the release, and the Sherman had to remain in position as bait, well within killing range of the Tiger's 88mm gun. They waited for 3 hours. The fog that had aided German operations now aided them, reducing visibility to perhaps 200 meters. They heard the Tiger before they saw it, that distinctive rumble of the Maybach V12 engine, the metallic clank of tracks on frozen ground. The sound grew closer, and the crew went through their own mental preparation. The gunner loaded armor-piercing rounds, though everyone knew they were essentially useless. The driver kept the engine running, ready for immediate evacuation if the plan failed. The commander watched through his periscope, calculating angles and distance. When the Tiger emerged from the fog, it was alone, a scout, most likely, ranging ahead of a larger formation. The commander must have seen the Sherman immediately, and his reaction was exactly what they'd predicted: no hesitation, just a steady advance to close the range. Tiger doctrine emphasized the psychological impact of their presence. Why waste time maneuvering when you could simply drive forward and eliminate the threat? If you have your own story about battlefield ingenuity, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The Tiger entered the narrows at approximately 10 kilometers per hour, cautious but confident. The loader, positioned behind cover with a direct line to the release anchor, watched the cable begin to draw taut. This was the critical moment. Too early, and the cable would simply fall away. Too late, and the Tiger might clear the trap entirely. He waited until he could see the cable starting to strain, the trees it was anchored to beginning to bend slightly under the load. Then he pulled the release. What happened next occurred in less than 3 seconds, but those who witnessed it described the moment in almost slow-motion detail. The cable, suddenly released from one anchor point while under tremendous tension from the Tiger's weight, didn't simply fall. It snapped laterally with enough force to be audible, even over the tank's engine, to sound like a gunshot. Sharp and violent. The steel cable, weighing approximately 60 pounds per 100 feet and traveling at speeds that would later be estimated at over 150 miles per hour, struck the Tiger's right side track assembly. The damage was catastrophic. The cable severed 3 track links instantly and bent the drive sprocket badly enough that it jammed against the hull. But the secondary effects were even more significant. The sudden resistance caused the right track to lock while the left track continued moving, creating an immediate and violent rotation. The Tiger, still carrying forward momentum, essentially pivoted on its damaged track, the hull swinging sideways in the narrow space between the trees. The Tiger commander's training would have told him to stop immediately, assess the Maz, and radio for support. But training operates on the assumption of rational circumstances. What he faced was something entirely outside his experiences in vulnerable tank. Suddenly immobilized in a confined space, with an enemy vehicle still operational. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The Sherman crew didn't fire. They didn't need to. The Tiger's turret was traversing, searching for the threat, but the damaged track meant the entire hull was at an angle that made accurate shooting difficult. More critically, the Tiger commander now faced a decision: remain in a disabled tank in confined terrain while an enemy vehicle, however inferior, maintained freedom of movement, or abandon the vehicle and retreat to reform with supporting elements. Veterans from both sides described this moment as one of the most psychologically complex in armored warfare. A Tiger wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of German armored superiority. Abandoning one went against every instinct and bit of training. But the mathematics of the situation were undeniable. A disabled tank is a dead tank, regardless of how thick its armor is. And a crew that dies trying to fight from a stationary position serves no strategic purpose. The Tiger crew they popped smoke grenade standard procedure to cover withdraw land, withdrew through the forest on foot. The entire engagement, from the Tiger's appearance to the crew's withdrawal, lasted approximately 8 minutes. No shots had been fired. No one had been killed. But a Tiger tank, worth more than 5 Shermans in terms of production resources and battlefield value, now sat abandoned in the Ardennes forest, its tracked assembly so badly damaged that recovery would require specialized equipment and hours of work. The Sherman crew didn't stay to verify the kill or attempt to destroy the Tiger. They'd already used their luck for the day. They navigated back toward friendly lines using the fog as cover, eventually rejoining their unit 36 hours later. Their after-action report described the encounter in technical terms, focusing on the mechanical aspects rather than the psychological dimensions. Intelligence officers noted the incident but filed it as an anomaly, one of thousands of small actions that occurred during the Ardennes offensive. But the story didn't end there. Word of the encounter spread through the tank units in ways that official reports never could. Crews shared the story during maintenance breaks, in field kitchens, around fires during cold nights. The details evolved, as such stories always do, but the core remained consistent. There were ways to fight Tigers that didn't require superior firepower. You needed understanding, timing, and the willingness to think beyond conventional doctrine. If you have your own story about unconventional tactics, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The mechanical principles behind the cable trap revealed something fundamental about armored warfare that often gets lost in discussions of gun calibers and armor thickness. Vulnerability isn't always where you expect it. The Tiger's track system, despite being robust by the standards of the time, was still a complex mechanical assembly with multiple potential failure points. Each track consisted of approximately 100 links, each link connected by pins that had to withstand tremendous stress during normal operation. The drive sprockets, which transferred engine power to the tracks, were precision machined components that couldn't function if bent even slightly out of alignment. Under normal circumstances, these components were protected by the tank's operational doctrine. Tigers didn't drive through hazardous terrain if they could avoid it. They didn't expose their running gear unnecessarily, but the cable trap had exploited the one condition where this protection broke down: forward momentum in confined spaces. The Tiger commander, confident in his vehicle's superiority, had driven into a situation where his armor and firepower were irrelevant. The trap had attacked the one system his armor couldn't protect. The broader implications went beyond individual tactics. The encounter demonstrated that the psychological dimensions of armored warfare mattered as much as technical specifications. Tiger crews operated with a mindset built on invulnerability. That mindset was generally accurate in direct combat. Tigers were nearly unbeatable, but it also created a vulnerability to unexpected situations. A Tiger crew encountering something completely outside their experience might react with the same kind of caution or fear that Sherman crews felt as routine. This psychological dimension had been understood to some degree by military theorists throughout history, but it was rarely discussed in the context of armored warfare, which tended to focus on quantifiable factors: armor, thickness, penetration values, mechanical reliability. The idea that you could make a Tiger retreat through mechanical sabotage rather than direct fire challenged assumptions about how tank combat worked. The technique itself, while effective in this instance, was never adopted as standard doctrine. The circumstances required for success were too specific. You needed confined terrain, a solo enemy vehicle, time to prepare the trap, precise knowledge of enemy vehicle dimensions, and an enemy commander who would advance without caution. These conditions rarely aligned. Most importantly, the tactic required exposing a valuable tank as bait, which ran counter to every principle of armored warfare preservation. But the broader lesson that unconventional approaches could level the playing field against superior equipment did filter through the ranks. Tank crews began thinking more creatively about how to engage Tigers. Some units experimented with coordinated ambushes using terrain features. Others developed tactics for attacking from multiple angles simultaneously to overwhelm the Tiger's ability to engage all threats. A few crews even attempted variations on the cable trap, though with limited success. The winter of 1944 to 1945 saw numerous such innovations born from necessity. American forces, facing equipment that was often inferior to German counterparts in direct comparisons, compensated through superior logistics, better coordination, and a willingness to adapt tactics to circumstances. The cable trap represented an extreme example of this adaptability, but it fit within a broader pattern of American operational flexibility. From the German perspective, the incident, if it was even reported up the command chain, would have been seen as an unfortunate anomaly. Tiger losses were carefully documented, and abandonment of a serviceable vehicle was a serious matter. But the chaos of the Ardennes offensive meant that individual incidents often went uninvestigated. The Tiger in question was likely recovered eventually, assuming German forces maintained control of the area long enough to bring in recovery equipment, or it was destroyed by its own side to prevent capture, or it was simply abandoned as German forces retreated in the face of Allied counter. The recovery rope itself, the central tool in this engagement, represented a class of equipment that military forces often overlook. Support gear that has potential secondary applications. Extended loadout equipment for tanks included items designed for very specific purposes: recovery operations, tools, stowage, spare track links, basic repair equipment. But under pressure, that equipment could be repurposed in ways the designers never intended. If you have your own story about improvised equipment use, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The logging camp connects in there's previous civilian Another aspect of military effectiveness that defies easy quantification. American forces in World War II were drawn from an extremely diverse civilian population. Men brought skills from every imaginable background: farming, manufacturing, construction, mining, forestry. These skills, while not military in nature, often proved valuable in unexpected ways. The loader understood cable dynamics because he'd spent years working with similar equipment in a completely different context. That understanding translated directly into battlefield effectiveness when circumstances aligned. This cross-pollination of civilian and military expertise was one of America's less visible advantages in the war. While German forces emphasized professional military training and specialized knowledge, American forces integrated whatever skills their personnel brought with them. Sometimes this resulted in inefficiency or confusion, but it also meant that American units had access to a broader range of problem-solving approaches. When conventional military solutions failed, someone in the unit often had civilian experience that suggested alternatives. The psychological aftermath for both crews would have been significant, though in very different ways. For the Sherman crew, the incident likely reinforced the sense that survival against superior forces was possible through cleverness and preparation. They'd faced the tiger-to-nightmare scenario of every Sherman crew and won without firing a shot. That kind of experience builds confidence that transcends equipment disadvantages. It suggests that the outcome of an engagement isn't predetermined by technical specifications. For the Tiger crew, the psychological impact would have been more complex and potentially more damaging. They'd been forced to abandon their vehicle, not through direct combat, but through something they couldn't even identify initially. The moment when their track failed would have been profoundly disorienting. Violent mechanical failure without apparent cause. The decision to evacuate, while tactically sound, would have felt like a defeat in ways that even a legitimate combat loss might not. They'd been forced out of their invulnerable fortress by an enemy they considered inferior. These psychological dimensions accumulated across thousands of engagements throughout the European theater. German forces, facing increasing odds and deteriorating strategic positions, began to doubt the invincibility that their equipment had previously promised. American forces, winning engagements through tactics, coordination, and occasionally sheer creativity, gained confidence that allowed them to take calculated risks that might otherwise have seemed suicidal. The technical aftermath of the cable trap would have been interesting from an engineering perspective. The Tiger's damaged track would have required extensive repair or replacement. The drive sprocket, if bent badly enough, might have been a complete write-off, requiring shipment from a rear area depot. The track links themselves could potentially be replaced in the field, but doing so required specialized tools and several hours of work by trained mechanics. All of this assumed that German forces maintained control of the area long enough to conduct repairs, a substantial assumption during the fluid fighting of the Ardennes offensive. Sherman recovery equipment was standardized across all vehicles, which meant the cable and anchoring gear used in this trap were identical to those carried by thousands of other tanks. This standardization was both a strength and a limitation. It meant that crews could rely on consistent equipment across different vehicles and could easily acquire replacements. But it also meant that innovation in equipment design moved slowly. If someone discovered a better way to use standard equipment, that knowledge spread through informal channels rather than official modifications. The trees used as anchor points would have borne distinctive scars from the cable tension and release. Foresters familiar with the Ardennes would be able to identify such damage decades later: deep gouges in the bark, abraded wood, sometimes permanent deformation of the trunk where extreme force had been applied. The battlefield archaeology of such encounters persists long after the human participants are gone. Metal detectorists and historians have found evidence of similar improvised defenses throughout the European theater, though connecting specific finds to documented incidents is often impossible. If you have your own story about battlefield archaeology, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The fog that had enabled both the German offensive and the Sherman crew's survival played a critical role throughout the Ardennes campaign. Weather conditions from mid-December 1944 through early January 1945 were consistently poor, with low clouds, fog, and snow that grounded Allied aircraft and limited visibility to a few hundred meters. These conditions neutralized American air superiority, which had been a decisive factor in previous campaigns. Tank crews operated with the knowledge that they couldn't rely on air support, that engagements would be resolved at close range, and that the normal advantages of American operational doctrine were temporarily suspended. This environmental context made improvisation even more critical. Standard American tactics relied heavily on coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air support. When some of these elements became unavailable, tank crews had to compensate through increased independence and creative. The cable trap represented an extreme example of this adaptation, but countless smaller innovations occurred throughout the campaign. As crews adjusted to conditions that negated their usual advantages, the 8-minute duration of the engagement from the Tiger's appearance to the crew's withdrawal was remarkably short for an action that would be remembered and discussed for decades. Combat veterans often note this compression of time, the way significant events unfold in minutes or even seconds while ordinary periods stretched on indefinitely. The Sherman crew would have experienced those 8 minutes with hyperreal clarity, every detail magnified by adrenaline and fear. The wait for the Tiger to enter the trap, the moment of the cable's release. The agonizing seconds watching to see if the damage would be sufficient to each of these moments would have felt extended beyond its actual duration. The decision to withdraw, rather than attempt to destroy or capture the disabled Tiger, reflected sound tactical judgment. Remaining near the damaged vehicle would have accomplished nothing meaningful. The Tiger was already effectively neutralized without mobility. It couldn't threaten American positions or support German operations. Attempting to destroy it would have required remaining in the area, which invited retaliation from supporting German forces, and the Sherman crew's primary objective was rejoining friendly lines, not maximizing enemy equipment destruction. This kind of tactical restraint, knowing when to disengage rather than press an advantage, is often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on dramatic action. But it represents mature military judgment that comes from experience. The Sherman crew understood that they'd already achieved more than could reasonably be expected. Further risk served no purpose. Getting themselves and their vehicle back to friendly lines meant they'd be available for future operations, which had greater strategic value than destroying one already immobilized enemy tank. The route they took back to friendly lines would have been carefully chosen to avoid German positions while navigating through heavily forested terrain with limited visibility. The driver's skill would have been critical, maintaining enough speed to minimize exposure time while avoiding obstacles that could disable their vehicle. The commander would have been constantly evaluating whether to risk radio communication, which could reveal their position, against the value of coordinating with friendly forces. Every decision involved weighing immediate risks against strategic objectives. The 36 hours between the engagement and their reunion with their unit would have been exhausting. Tank crews in combat zones operated under constant stress, with brief periods of high-intensity action punctuated by longer periods of uncertainty and vigilance. Sleep was opportunistic and rarely restful. Food was eaten cold because cooking fires revealed positions. Bodily functions were managed with minimal privacy and maximum speed. The romanticized image of armored warfare rarely captures these mundane but critical realities of sustained operations. If you have your own story about sustained combat operations, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The after-action report filed by the Sherman crew would have been sanitized of much of the psychological and personal detail that makes the incident compelling. Military documentation focuses on tactical facts: enemy contact, actions taken, results achieved, casualties sustained, equipment status, the emotional dimensions to fear, the desperate innovation. The relief at survival exists only in personal accounts and informal histories. This gap between official record and lived experience is one reason why veteran interviews and personal memoirs remain so valuable to historians. They capture dimensions of warfare that official documents systematically exclude. Intelligence officers reviewing the report might have been skeptical of the account. A tiger forced to withdraw without firing a shot, defeated by improvised use of recovery equipment. It sounded almost too convenient. Too much like the kind of story that grows in the telling, but the physical evidence would have been difficult to dispute. If the Tiger was later found by American forces, the damage to its track assembly would have been consistent with the described mechanism, and the absence of combat damage on the Sherman itself supported the claim that no direct fire exchange had occurred. The stories spread through armored units demonstrated the informal knowledge networks that existed within military organizations. Official channels moved information slowly and selectively, but tankers talked to other tankers during rest periods at supply points and field hospitals. Stories that captured imagination or offered tactical value spread rapidly through these networks, often mutating in the process but retaining core details that were verifiable. The cable trap story survived because it offered both psychological comfort, tigers could be beaten, and tactical insight. Mobility was as critical as firepower. Some crews attempted to replicate the tactic in subsequent engagements with varying results. The specific circumstances required for success rarely aligned perfectly, but the underlying crews began paying more attention to terrain features that could channel enemy movement. They looked for ways to create situations where superior German armor and firepower became liabilities rather than advantages. Not all of these experiments succeeded, but they represented a shift in mindset from passive defense to active The German response to such tactics, if there was an organized response, would have involved updated guidance to Tiger crews about operating in confined terrain. Commanders might have been reminded to scout choke points before entering them, to maintain greater spacing between vehicles, to be alert for unusual obstacles or terrain features. But these reminders would have competed with hundreds of other tactical considerations that Tiger crews had to manage simultaneously. The reality of late war operations meant that even experienced crews were often overwhelmed by the complexity of their environment. The production context for both the Tiger and Sherman tanks added another layer to the encounter. By winter 1944, German industry was under tremendous strain. Tiger production required specialized facilities, skilled labor, and raw materials that were increasingly scarce. Each tiger represented thousands of man-hours of work and resources that could have produced multiple smaller tanks. Losing one, even through mechanical damage rather than combat destruction, represented a significant material loss that Germany could not easily replace. Sherman production, by contrast, operated on a massive scale with standardized components and assembly line methods. American industry could replace lost Shermans faster than they could be destroyed in combat. This asymmetry meant that trading Shermans for Tigers even at seemingly unfavorable exchange ratios worked in America's favor strategically. The cable trap incident, which neutralized a Tiger without losing a Sherman, represented an ideal outcome from this industrial warfare perspective. The crew members themselves would have carried the memory of this engagement for the rest of their lives. Veterans often describe certain moments that stay with exceptional clarity. Specific images, sounds, even smells that remain vivid decades later. The Tiger emerging from the fog, the sound of the cable releasing. The sight of that massive vehicle suddenly immobilized. These would have been defining moments in their personal narratives of the war. Some might have talked about it frequently, others might have kept it private, sharing only with fellow veterans who could understand the context. If you have your own story about lasting memories from combat, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The technical specifications that made the cable trap possible reveal interesting details about both vehicles involved. The Sherman's recovery cable had a braking strength of approximately 40,000 pounds, enough to tow the tank itself under most conditions. When that cable was placed under tension by a Tiger's 70-ton weight and then suddenly released, the stored energy in the steel created forces that exceeded what the Tiger's track assembly was designed to withstand. The track links, each designed to bear the tank's weight when properly distributed across the entire track length, couldn't handle the concentrated lateral force of a cable moving at high velocity. The Tiger's track design, while robust, had inherent vulnerabilities that this engagement exploited. Each track link was connected by a pin that had to be strong enough to resist normal operational stresses but could be removed for maintenance. This requirement for field serviceability meant the pins couldn't be permanently integrated or welded, which created a potential failure point. A sufficient lateral force could shear these pins or drive them out of alignment, causing the track to separate. The cable trap delivered exactly this kind of force. The positioning calculation that the loader performed estimating, where to place the cable to hit the track assembly rather than passing under or over it, required understanding the Tiger's dimensions without having direct measurements. He would have relied on intelligence briefings that included silhouette recognition and approximate dimensions, combined with his own observations from previous encounters. The margin for error was perhaps 6 inches in either direction. Too low, and the cable would pass under the tank harmlessly. Too high, and it might strike the hull or sponson where it would cause minimal damage. This precision, achieved under battlefield conditions without surveying equipment or careful measurement, speaks to the kind of practical estimation skills that combat experience develops. Tank crews became adept at calculating angles, distances, and trajectories through repeated exposure and the immediate feedback that combat provides. Mistakes in these calculations had obvious consequences, which focused the learning process with exceptional intensity. The choice to use trees as anchor points rather than vehicles or other mobile objects was critical to the trap's success. Trees provided both stability and the specific kind of limited flexibility that the trap required. A rigid anchor would have simply broken under the tension. A completely flexible anchor would have absorbed the force without creating the whip-like release that caused damage. Trees, with their combination of strength and slight give, provided the ideal anchoring characteristic. The drop loop technique that secured the cable came directly from the loader's logging experience. In forestry operations, cables are often used to control falling trees or drag logs across difficult terrain. The drop loop allows workers to maintain control under normal loads but release quickly in emergency situations. For example, if a tree begins falling in an unexpected direction, the same principle, applied to armored warfare, created a remotely triggered mechanism that could release massive amounts of energy on command. The 3-hour wait before the Tiger appeared would have been psychologically taxing. The crew had committed to a plan that required them to remain stationary and exposed. Every sound from the forest could have been approaching enemy forces. The fog that aided their concealment also meant they couldn't see potential threats until they were very close. The temptation to abandon the plan and attempt escape would have been constant, requiring discipline and trust in their collective judgment. The Tiger commander's decision to advance directly toward the Sherman, rather than maneuvering for position or calling for support, reflected the tactical confidence that Tiger crews generally felt. From his perspective, he'd encountered a lone Sherman in a relatively open area. Standard doctrine was clear: close the range, eliminate the threat, continue the mission. The possibility that the Sherman was bait for a trap likely didn't occur to him because such traps were rare enough to be almost mythical. Tiger crews expected to encounter multiple Shermans, artillery, airstrikes, or anti-tank guns. They didn't expect engineering traps. If you have your own story about tactical confidence and its limits, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The sound of the cable release described as like a gunshot would have been the first indication to the Tiger crew that something was wrong. That distinctive crack, followed immediately by the violent resistance in the right track, would have triggered immediate alarm. Tank crews are acutely sensitive to changes in their vehicles' sound and movement. Any unusual vibration, noise, or handling characteristic can indicate mechanical failure or damage. The suddenness and violence of the track disruption would have been unmistakable. The Tiger's rotation as the right track locked, essentially pivoting on the damaged side, would have been disorienting for the crew inside. The hull would have swung sideways with considerable force, potentially throwing crew members against interior surface. The gunner, trying to track the Sherman through his sight, would have found his target suddenly moving in unexpected ways as the entire vehicle rotated. The driver, feeling the right track fail, would have instinctively hit the brakes to prevent further damage, which would have brought the massive vehicle to a jarring stop. The commander's view from his cupola would have shown him a tactically impossible situation. His vehicle, immobilized at an angle that prevented effective main gun deployment, in confined terrain that prevented maneuver, with an enemy vehicle still mobile and potentially calling for reinforcements. The armor that had made him feel invulnerable was now irrelevant. The firepower that had made direct engagement a certainty of victory couldn't be brought to bear effectively, and remaining in position meant being a stationary target, perhaps the most vulnerable position any armored vehicle can occupy. The decision to evacuate rather than attempting to fight from the disabled vehicle involved rapid risk calculation. Could they repair the track under fire? Almost certainly not. Track repair required external work that would expose crew members to rifle fire or enemy tank rounds. Could they use the main gun from their current position? Possibly, but with reduced accuracy and no ability to respond to flanking maneuvers. Could they expect support from other German forces? On-and-on radio communication during the Ardennes offensive was often disrupted by terrain and atmospheric conditions. The only certain factor was that remaining in a disabled tank in enemy territory reduced their chance of survival. With each passing minute, the smoke grenades deployed during their evacuation were standard equipment for exactly this kind of situation. Each Tiger carried smoke dischargers that could create a concealing screen in seconds. The smoke wouldn't stop enemy fire, but it would prevent accurate targeting and provide precious seconds for crew evacuation. The Tiger crews withdrawal through the forests, moving on foot through snow and underbrush while hoping to avoid American patrols, would have been harrowing, especially knowing they'd just abandoned their vehicle, which was both their primary weapon and their greatest protection. The Sherman crew's decision not to fire on the evacuating Germans reflected several considerations. First, engaging dismounted personnel would have revealed their exact position and invited return fire from any supporting German forces in the area. Second, the primary mission remained survival and return to friendly lines, not maximizing enemy casualties. Third, there was a practical calculus that veteran crews often acknowledged privately. Today you showed mercy or restraint. Tomorrow, your opponent might do the same. These informal rules of engagement existed parallel to official doctrine, particularly in the fluid fighting of the Ardennes, where small unit actions occurred beyond immediate command oversight. The fog that had concealed the trap would continue to aid both crews as they withdrew from the area. Weather conditions that hampered larger-scale operations and air support could be advantageous for small units trying to avoid contact. The Sherman crew's navigation through uncertain terrain, avoiding German positions while searching for American lines, would have relied on basic skills: reading terrain, following water courses, moving generally westward based on compass heading, navigation without clear landmarks in enemy territory with limited visibility. These conditions turned simple movement into life. The reunion with their unit 36 hours later would have brought relief mixed with exascentar, and the immediate demands of military bureaucracy, after-action reports, maintenance assessments, ammunition resupply. Crew debriefing. The machinery of military administration doesn't pause for individual survival stories. The crew would have been questioned about their encounter, their route, enemy positions observed, terrain conditions, and a dozen other tactical details. The emotional dimensions to fear, the ingenuity, the sheer improbability of their survival would have been secondary to extracting actionable intelligence. The maintenance assessment of their Sherman would have been critical. 36 hours of operation in enemy territory, including the stress of the engagement itself, would have taken a toll on mechanical systems. Track tension would need checking. Engine fluids topped off, weapon systems cleaned and tested, radio equipment verified. The recovery cable they'd used would have been carefully inspected for damage. Steel cable loses integrity and becomes dangerous if not replaced. If the cable showed signs of stress beyond acceptable limits, it would have been swapped for new equipment before the tank returned to operational status. The statistical reality that this encounter represented one successful engagement among thousands during the Ardennes campaign highlights the challenge of drawing broader conclusions from individual actions. Military historians deal constantly with this tension between the specific and the general. The cable trap worked under very particular circumstances that rarely repeated, but the mindset that created the trap analyzing enemy vulnerabilities, leveraging available resources creatively, accepting calculated risk was broadly applicable. That mindset couldn't be reduced to doctrine or trained through conventional methods. It emerged from the intersection of personality, experience, and necessity.